Thanks for the privilege of your time. This is the Salvant report. Chinese President Xi Jinping is getting the US he always wanted. Since US American president returned to the White House in 2025, Washington has grown less confident in its global purpose, less committed to the rule-based order he once upheld, and more willing to wield power in ways that unsettle markets, institutions, and allies. Washington's global authority and credibility are wearing away. In one sense, this is good news for Beijing. A weaker, less moralistic Washington is harder for others to rally around. He offers a less compelling model. He has become less capable of organizing coalition and more likely to drive away the very partners he needs to balance China. For decades, Chinese leaders have wanted a US strong enough to keep the global economy afloat and prevent outright systemic collapse, but no longer capable of shaping the international order in ways that constrains China's rise. Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, is now closer to that outcome than any emperor or party leader of the past 2 centuries. Yet, that is not a victory for China. Xi doesn't want simply a diminished United States. He wants one that still helps to preserve a stable world order. That distinction is easy to miss in Washington, where analysts often assume that geopolitical competition works like a running scoreboard. If the US loses, China must win, and vice versa. But Beijing doesn't interpret every US setback as a Chinese gain. And Chinese leaders do not assume that every geopolitical opening must be exploited. The US-Israeli war on Iran, which has spiraled into a regional conflagration, is the most consequential test yet of China's strategic restraint. Unlike Ukraine's and Russia war in Ukraine, or unlike Russia wars in Ukraine, the war in Iran threatens China's core strategic interests. Not because of acute dependence on Middle Eastern hydrocarbons, but because an increasingly volatile Washington is destabilizing the global order on which Beijing depends. Not because of acute dependence on Middle Eastern hydrocarbons, but because, that's the key word, because an increasingly volatile Washington is destabilizing the global order on which Beijing depends. The danger for China lies not in immediate scarcity, but in disorder. A US that is simply weaker is manageable. One that is unpredictable, violent, and unconstrained by the system he once championed is far perilous. The American president was meant to meet with his Chinese counterpart, the Chinese president Xi Jinping, at the end of March to stabilize the world's most consequential bilateral relationship. But as the Middle East burned, energy prices skyrocketed, and the bodies and U.S. service members returned to the U.S., the American president reached the conclusion that a trip to Beijing for a high-profile meeting would not be a good look. And on March 16, he postponed the trip until May. The fact that he failed to foresee this collision of crises when he originally announced the summit just 8 days before he launched his war of choice on Iran exposes the administration's inability to manage multiple global challenges, even those of its own making. The American administration has bended a number of goals for its war in Iran, including regime change and destroying the country's nuclear program. Some President fans have even argued that bombing Iran will help the U.S. in its competition with China. Matt Pottinger, who served as a deputy national security advisor in the president's first term, contended in an interview with Bloomberg that the Iran war challenges China's axis of chaos, which also includes Iran, North Korea, and Russia. The Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, for his part, said in a March interview with Fox News that U.S. military interventions in all which Iran and Venezuela, which are friendly to Beijing, were China's nightmare. However, the reality is far different. Despite relying on energy imports that pass through the Strait of Hormuz, China has insulated itself against a near-term disruption in energy supplies. With the U.S. military bogged down in the Middle East, China has a freer hand in East Asia. As the president behaves erratically and violates international law, China can present itself as a responsible peacemaker. And even if the US-Iranian ceasefire, what now, that was agreed upon on April 7, holds, the US has injured its reputation by acting unpredictably, betraying its allies, and starting a war that has done serious damage to the global economy. When the US-Chinese summit eventually take place, Xi Jinping, Chinese president, will enter the talks with significant leverage. While the US squandered precious military and political capital in the Middle East, China was preparing to get what he wants at the negotiating table. The American president of choice in Iran has come at the expense of the US security umbrella in the Indo-Pacific, presenting an opportunity for Beijing. That's what we said the Iran war is a win for China. The US has moved materials from East Asia to the Middle East, including the US Abraham Lincoln, one of only 5 US aircraft carriers on active duty globally, and powerful missile defense system also. Many of these batteries were taken from South Korea, which for years endured aggressive Chinese economic pressure in retaliation for hosting US anti-missile systems that were supposed to permanently shield the country from an attack by China's partner, North Korea. The US repossessions of those assets over Seoul's objections showed how little Washington cared about its allies' sacrifices, and its willingness to divert critical resources sent a message to all US partners in Asia that the region is not a priority for the US. The question that have been raised about American staying power have already weakened deterrence against both North Korea and China. The war in Iran has also given China a live demonstration of the U.S. military capabilities, which Beijing can now use to hone and adapt its own tactics. In a conflict with the U.S., China might adjust strike density to overwhelm U.S. defenses and modify sequencing attacks to exploit reloading windows. To capitalize on the chaos, Beijing would likely position itself as a mediator. And according to the New York Times, China helped persuade Iran to accept the ceasefire of April 7. China, according to the New York Times, has persuaded Iran to accept the April 7 ceasefire. To be sure, the war in Iran has caused some problem for China. Its manufacturing sector has been squeezed by higher energy prices, and Chinese farmers have had to deal with higher fertilizer prices during the spring planting season. And you know, much of the urea, an ingredient in fertilizer, is shipped through the Strait of Hormuz. But China's economy is resilient and its energy supply are relatively secured. Because China already dominates manufacturing of battery, solar panel, wind turbine, and electric cars, the war will likely increase global adoption of the country's technology as a caution against current and future energy shocks. Although China cannot rival the US in terms of oil production capacity, its massive stockpiles, now estimated at 1.4 billion barrels, dwarf the depleted U.S. strategic petroleum reserve. Because of the global nature of the oil marketplace, a reduction in the supply of oil anywhere in the world means an increase in prices everywhere, including the USA. The U.S. military intervention in Iran, like the one in Venezuela, is not going to help the U.S. in its competition with China by isolating Beijing from these two purported partners. However, China is the ultimate fair weather friend. It is highly transactional, and will not sacrifice its core interests to save neither Tehran or Caracas. If anything, the American president's impulsive militarism has weakened the U.S. position relative to China's. And despite his America's first branding, the impulsive war with Iran has been a masterclass in putting America last. As Zoyu Luyu atrociously observing foreign affairs, it's a writer in foreign affairs, Zhou Liu, he said China prizes stability and doesn't want to take over every role the U.S. has filled for decades, such as serving as the Middle East policeman. Still, China stands to gain more than it loses from this war. As the U.S. speed up its own decline, let me say it again. As the U.S. speeds up its own decline, China is accelerating its technological self-sufficiency, building its military strength, and upgrading its industrial policy. Its ultimate goal is so-called national rejuvenation. When the president, the American president, lands in Beijing, he will represent the U.S. from a position of self-inflicted weakness. Self-inflicted weakness. He will face a formidable counterpart in Xi, who has spent years preparing for this exact moment of U.S. overreach. It is time for the United States to stop fighting the wars China wants to fight and instead train its focus back on its greatest rival, China. Thank you for your time. This is the Salvant Report. You have a blessed weekend.
Maurice,